You have no idea what it's like to see the man you love assault your beloved cousin hours before your wedding, and then smile at you as if nothing happened. My name is Charlotte Miller, but here in Riverdale Springs, folks know me as Grandma Charlotte. Today, I'm 83 years old, with white hair always arranged in a tight bun, and hands full of age spots from time gone by. Anyone who sees me now, a sweet old lady walking through the town square with my hand-carved wooden cane, would never imagine the story I've carried with me for more than 6 decades. Oh, but before I continue with my story, darlings, if you're finding this tale interesting already, please hit that like button and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales. It only takes a second, and it helps this old lady's stories reach more people who might need to hear them. Your support means everything to me. Now, let me get back to my story. This story I've never told to anyone until today. I've kept it inside my heart like a sharp dagger that I couldn't remove without hurting myself even more. But now, in the autumn of my life, I feel I need to tell it. I need you to know what happened on that May 12th, 1957, the day that should have been the happiest of my life. But before I continue, I want to know who's listening to me. From which corner of America are you watching this old lady talk about the wounds of the past? Tell me in the comments, and if this story touches your heart, please give this video a like. Maybe then, I'll find the courage to tell all parts of this nightmare I lived through. I was born and raised in Riverdale Springs, a small town in Virginia that in the 1950s was nothing more than a few cobblestone streets around a main church. My father, Joseph Miller, owned the town pharmacy, a respected man who prepared his own medicines and attended to the population when the only doctor in the region was busy or traveling. My mother, Catherine, gave piano lessons to the daughters of well-off families and sewed to supplement our income. We weren't rich, but we were respectable and well-regarded in the community. It was in that pharmacy, on a hot January afternoon in 1955, that I met Edward Thompson. He had just arrived in town to take over as manager of the only local bank branch. He was a tall, elegant young man with penetrating green eyes and a smile that lit up the room. A college graduate from the capital, son of an important banker from Richmond, Edward was considered an excellent catch. All the eligible young ladies in Riverdale sighed when he passed through the square, always impeccably dressed in his light-colored suits. That day, he came into the pharmacy with a prescription for a headache. My father was making a delivery, and I, who helped at the counter when I wasn't studying, served him. Our first meeting was brief, but his eyes followed me in a way that made me blush to the roots of my hair. The following Sunday after church, he approached me and my mother and asked permission to accompany us on our walk around the square, as was customary at the time. That's how our courtship began, always supervised as the social norms of the 50s demanded. My mother or some aunt always accompanied us, sitting strategically a few yards away on the park bench while we conversed. On Sundays, Edward would have lunch at our home after church. Everything was very respectful and traditional, as was expected at the time. He courted me with flowers, poetry books, and fine chocolates that he ordered from the capital. He treated me like a princess. Always attentive, always a gentleman. In less than 3 months, we were already talking about marriage. I remember my mother's face when I told her that Edward had asked to officially court me. She looked as if she'd won the lottery. A man like that, cultured, educated, from a good family. You're lucky, my daughter, she said, stroking my hair. After a year of courtship came the official marriage proposal. Edward spoke with my father in the visiting room, while my mother and I waited anxiously in the kitchen, pretending to prepare coffee that no one would drink. When they emerged smiling, I knew my fate was sealed. I received an engagement ring with a small diamond, an extravagance by the town's standards. The neighbors would visit us just to see the shiny stone on my finger. The wedding preparations consumed 6 entire months. It would be held in the main church, of course, with a reception at the recreational club, the most elegant in town. My dress was ordered from Richmond, a dream of lace and silk that cost the equivalent of 3 months of my father's salary. The guest list included over 200 people, practically the entire society of Riverdale, and some important figures from neighboring towns. Edward lived alone in a rented house near the bank, but was already building our future residence, a 2-story house with a front porch on the main street of town. It would be the most modern house in Riverdale, with electrical installations in all rooms and even a private telephone, a luxury that few families could afford at the time. We met almost daily, always under supervision, of course, and planned our future in detail. How many children we would have. He wanted 3. I dreamed of 4. What the living room furniture would be like. I preferred the classic style, he, something more modern. Where we would spend our honeymoon, he promised New York City, a place I had never visited. I was living in a dream, floating among clouds of happiness. The weeks before the wedding were pure joy. My mother and my aunts talked of nothing else. The embroidered sheets for the trousseau, the towels with my initials intertwined with Edward's, the new pots gleaming in the kitchen awaiting their new owner. Everything was being prepared with such care, such love. A week before the big day, relatives from out of town started to arrive. Among them was my cousin Helen, daughter of my father's sister, who lived in Norfolk. Helen was 18, 2 years younger than me, and we were very close in childhood. When her family moved away, we kept in touch through letters. She was a beautiful girl with long brown hair and large, expressive eyes. More reserved than me, more shy, but with a smile that illuminated the room when she felt comfortable. Helen arrived 3 days before the wedding, along with my aunt and uncle. As our house was already full with other relatives, they stayed at my godmother's house, Miss Eugenia, just a few blocks away. I remember hugging Helen at the train station, feeling that joy of reuniting with someone dear after so long. I had so much to tell her, so many details about Edward and our plans that couldn't fit in the letters we exchanged. I introduced Helen to my fiancé the next day during a lunch at my parents' house. Edward was his usual charming self, kind, attentive, asking about her studies, about Norfolk, making her feel important with his attention. Helen, always shy, responded with few words, eyes downcast, a restrained smile. I attributed her behavior to her natural shyness, to the fatigue from the journey. In the days that followed, however, I noticed something strange. Helen seemed to be avoiding me. When I entered a room, she would find an excuse to leave. When I tried to start a conversation about the wedding preparations, she would respond with monosyllables, without the enthusiasm I expected. I came to ask if everything was all right, if she felt sick. "Just tired," she would respond with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. On the eve of the wedding, as tradition dictated, I spent the night at my parents' house. Edward, following custom, went to dinner with his groomsmen and friends, a sort of tame bachelor party at a restaurant in town. Helen and the other young ladies of the family helped me prepare some last-minute things. The tiara of flowers I would wear with the veil, some details on the dress. I remember Helen being so quiet that night, with deep circles under her eyes, red as if she had been crying. When I asked her again if something was wrong, she held my hands tightly and looked at me in such an intense way that it frightened me. "Are you sure, Charlotte? Absolutely sure that this is the man you want to spend the rest of your life with?" The question caught me by surprise. Of course I was sure. Edward was perfect in every way, handsome, educated, successful, respectful. What more could a girl want? "I'm as sure as I can be," I responded, confused by the question. "Why are you asking me this on the eve of my wedding, Helen?" She shook her head, released my hands, and murmured something about just being tired, that it was nothing. Soon after, she excused herself and went to bed. I was intrigued by that strange conversation, but there were so many details to resolve, so many emotions on that eve, that I ended up not giving it much importance. How could I have imagined what was behind those questions, behind that anguished look? How could I have known that while I was dreaming of my white dress and my perfect future, Helen was carrying a secret so painful that she could barely look at me without breaking down? On the morning of my wedding, I woke up with a light heart, eager for the big moment. The hairdresser would come at 10 o'clock, the makeup artist soon after. The wedding would be at 4 p.m., followed by the reception that would go late into the night. The dress was hanging on a special hanger, protected by a fine fabric. My mother had been up for hours, coordinating the final preparations. That's when I realized I hadn't seen Helen since breakfast. I asked about her, and my mother said she had gone to Miss Eugenia's house to retrieve something she had forgotten. I found it strange, but again, there were so many things happening around me that I couldn't focus on it. The hairdresser arrived and began to prepare my hair for the big moment. Aunts came and went through the room, adjusting details, bringing tea, talking non-stop. And then, in the midst of that joyful confusion, I heard a noise at the front door, raised voices. My mother entered the room, her face pale. "Continue getting ready," she said, forcing a smile that didn't fool anyone. "Just a small problem with the flowers, nothing that can't be fixed." But I knew my mother too well to believe that excuse. Something was wrong, very wrong. And that feeling was confirmed when minutes later I heard quiet crying coming from the next room. Crying that I immediately recognized as Helen's. That's when everything started to crumble. Can you imagine what it's like to have your heart broken into 1,000 pieces hours before what should be the happiest moment of your life? No? I don't think so. And I sincerely hope you never find out. Because that pain, that feeling that the world is crumbling beneath your feet, is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But on that May morning in 1957, that's exactly what I experienced. And the worst was yet to come. Fear consumed me at that instant. Without thinking twice, I got up from the chair, ignoring the protests of the hairdresser who was trying to finish my hairdo. I felt the pins holding only half of my hair, the other half still loose over my shoulders. I didn't care. I walked to the neighboring room like a sleepwalker, dragged by a force greater than my will. The sounds around me seemed distant. The voices of my aunts, the worried murmur of my mother, the clinking of cups in the kitchen. Everything seemed to be happening in another dimension. The only real thing was that muffled crying coming from the other side of the door. When I opened the door to the guest room, the scene I found remains etched in my memory as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Helen was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face in her hands, her body shaken by silent sobs. My Aunt Eleanor, her mother, kneeling in front of her, trying in vain to comfort her. "What happened?" I asked, my voice firmer than I actually felt. The two raised their eyes, startled by my sudden presence. Helen's face was unrecognizable, swollen, red, with a purplish mark appearing at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes, which I had so admired for their liveliness, were now opaque, lifeless. Her light yellow dress, which she was supposed to wear as a bridesmaid at my wedding, was thrown on a nearby chair with a bloodstain on the neckline. "Nothing, dear. Go back to getting ready," my aunt said, trying to steer me away from the door. "Helen is just a bit indisposed. Nothing serious," but my gaze was fixed on my cousin's eyes. Those eyes I had known since childhood, and which now silently pleaded for something I still didn't understand. I disengaged from my aunt and approached Helen, kneeling in front of her. "What happened to you?" I asked directly, holding her cold hands in mine. "Who did this to your face?" Helen averted her gaze, more tears streaming down her pale cheeks. My aunt tried again to intervene, but I raised my hand, silencing her. "Tell me the truth, Helen, please." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. I heard footsteps in the hallway, my mother entering the room, hurried whispers that I couldn't decipher, but I didn't divert my attention from Helen. Finally, she spoke, her voice so low that I had to lean in to hear. It was Edward. Just 2 words, only 2 words, and my entire world collapsed. At first, I thought I had misheard. How could it be Edward, my Edward, the kind, educated, respectful man? "What are you saying?" I murmured incredulously. "Edward isn't even here. He spent the night with the groomsmen. He came here this morning, early," Helen continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He said he wanted to see the room where you were getting ready, to leave a surprise gift. Aunt Catherine had gone out to get the flowers, and my father and mother went to the hotel to get Grandma." She paused, more tears streaming down. My aunt was now crying silently, one hand over her mouth as if to prevent a scream from escaping. My mother was petrified at the door, her face a mask of disbelief. "When I saw him, I was surprised, but I let him in. He was your fiancé after all. He asked to see your dress. I said I couldn't show it, that it would bring bad luck. Then he started to act strangely. Said he had always found me attractive, that since he saw me at lunch days ago, he couldn't stop thinking about me." Each word was like a blade cutting my heart into pieces. Helen continued, her voice now a whisper interspersed with sobs. I tried to leave, but he blocked the door, said he wanted an advance on what he would have at the wedding. I screamed, but no one heard. The house was empty except for the children playing in the backyard. He covered my mouth, pushed me against the wall. I couldn't hear the rest. A buzzing took over my ears, and the room seemed to spin around me. I felt hands holding me, preventing me from falling. It was my mother, who was now by my side, her face wet with tears. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" I managed to ask, looking at my aunt, my mother, Helen. "We wanted to spare you," my aunt replied, her voice trembling. "Your father went looking for Edward, but no one has found him yet. We thought of canceling the wedding without telling you the reason, just postponing. You were so happy, so radiant." A rage like I had never felt before began to grow within me. Rage at Edward, of course, but also at my family for thinking they could hide this from me, for thinking I would be incapable of dealing with the truth, for wanting to spare my feelings while my cousin suffered. "Where is my father now?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "He and your Uncle Paul went looking for Edward at the hotel where the groomsmen are staying. It seems he left early, said he had some matters to settle before the wedding." I stood up, legs shaky, but determination growing with each second. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. 11:45 in the morning. The wedding would be at 4 p.m. "We're not going to cancel anything," I declared, to the astonishment of everyone. "The wedding will happen exactly as planned." "But Charlotte, you can't marry that monster!" exclaimed my mother, horrified. "I didn't say I was going to marry him, Mother. I said the wedding will happen as planned. Now I need your help." I returned to my room where the hairdresser was waiting, confused. I asked him to finish my hairstyle, ignoring his curious glances at my face, now stained with tears. While he worked, my mind was buzzing with thoughts, images, plans. I saw Helen's face, marked by violence. I saw Edward's charming smile, that same smile that had won me over at the pharmacy 2 years before. I saw the small diamond on my finger, symbol of a promise now shattered. The makeup artist arrived, and I let her cover the marks of my crying with powder and foundation. On the outside, I was transforming into the perfect bride everyone expected. On the inside, I was transforming into something completely different. Meanwhile, I sent for my godmother, Miss Eugenia, a strong woman, widowed for 10 years, who managed alone the largest rural property in the region. If there was someone who could help me with what I was planning, it was her. When Miss Eugenia arrived, I asked everyone to leave the room. She was an imposing woman of almost 60, straight back and penetrating gaze. I told her everything, omitting no detail of what Helen had revealed. Unlike my mother, she didn't cry. Her eyes narrowed, and an expression I had never seen on her aristocratic face took form, a mixture of fury and cold determination. "What do you want to do, my child?" she asked simply. I explained my plan. It was risky. It was scandalous. It was unthinkable for a young woman of good family in the 50s. But it was the only form of justice I could envision at that moment. Miss Eugenia listened in silence, occasionally nodding. When I finished, she remained quiet for a few moments, as if pondering each detail. "It will cause the biggest scandal this town has ever seen," she finally said. "Your reputation will never be the same." "I don't care," I replied, surprised by my own conviction. "I can't allow him to do this to other women. I can't let Helen carry this pain alone." Miss Eugenia smiled, a sad smile but full of admiration. "Then let's do it. I need an hour to organize everything." She left, and I continued preparing. The dress was brought in, that dream of lace and silk for which my parents had paid a fortune. I let them help me dress while I listened to the muffled voices in the hallway. My father had returned without finding Edward. The guests would start arriving in a few hours. The pastor was being informed of a small delay, but not a cancellation. At 1 p.m., Miss Eugenia returned. Everything was arranged, she told me in a whisper. She just needed me to confirm that I really wanted to go through with it. "There is no alternative," I replied. "He needs to pay for what he did. The whole town needs to know who Edward Thompson really is." At 3 p.m., the news we were waiting for arrived. Edward had been seen returning to his house. He was preparing for the wedding as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't destroyed my cousin's life hours before, as if he really were the honorable man everyone believed him to be. A wave of nausea invaded me as I imagined that if not for Helen's confession, I would now be marrying a monster. I would share his bed tonight. I would have children with him. I would live an entire life alongside someone capable of such an atrocity. Word came at 3:45. He had arrived at the church. He was waiting at the altar with the groomsmen. My father entered the room, his face aged 10 years in that single day. His expression was one of pure agony as he saw me completely dressed as a bride, the veil already covering my face. "Daughter, you don't have to do this," he said, taking my hands in his. "We can simply cancel. Say you fell ill. In a few months, when the dust settles, you can go to the capital, stay with your cousins until—" "No, Father," I interrupted gently. "I won't hide as if I did something wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. Helen didn't do anything wrong. It's he who needs to face the consequences of his actions." My father sighed, defeated. Deep down, he knew I was right, even if the price was too high. "Then let's go," he said, offering me his arm. The church was packed, as we expected. 200 people, the women in their best dresses, the men in dark suits. The decoration was stunning. The 300 white orchids that cost a fortune, the satin ribbons hanging from the pews, the lily arrangements at the altar. Edward was there, more handsome than ever in his light gray suit, his hair perfectly combed, that confident smile that once melted me and now turned my stomach. The organ began to play the wedding march. Heads turned to the entrance of the church, where I appeared beside my father. A murmur of admiration ran through the nave. The bride was beautiful. The dress was a dream. The bouquet of lilies and white roses perfectly matched with the altar arrangement. I began to walk slowly down the center aisle, my arm intertwined with my father's. I could feel his tremor, his hesitation with each step, but I advanced with determination, my eyes fixed on Edward, who awaited me with that rehearsed smile, those green eyes that now seemed empty to me, soulless. A few yards from the altar, I made an imperceptible signal to Miss Eugenia, seated in the first pew. She got up discreetly and left through a side door. It was the signal we had agreed upon. Everything was about to change. When I finally reached the altar, Edward extended his hand to me, his smile wider than ever. "You look stunning," he whispered as my father moved away to sit beside my mother. I looked at that extended hand, the same hand that hours before had hurt Helen, had violated her innocence, had destroyed her trust. Instead of accepting it, I slowly raised my veil, revealing not the shy smile of a passionate bride, but a cold, determined face of someone about to execute a sentence. It was the moment I had planned, the moment of truth, of justice, the moment that would forever change the course of my life and the lives of many other people in that small town in Virginia. What happened in the following minutes was etched in the collective memory of Riverdale Springs as the biggest scandal the quiet town had ever witnessed. A scandal that began with my words, spoken loud and clear for everyone in the church to hear. "There will be no wedding today." My voice echoed through the church, firm and clear. The silence that followed was absolute, as if everyone had stopped breathing at the same time. 200 faces frozen in expressions of disbelief stared at me. Edward, in front of me, turned pale, the rehearsed smile instantly disappearing. "Charlotte, what are you doing?" he whispered, extending his hand to touch my arm. I recoiled as if I had been burned. "Don't touch me," I said, loud enough for the first rows to hear. "Never put your hands on me again." The murmurs began to circulate through the church. I saw confusion on the pastor's face, shock on the guests. My father tried to stand up, but my mother held him by the arm. She knew what was about to happen. Miss Eugenia, in the first pew, nodded discreetly to me. It was time. "I want everyone to know why there will be no wedding," I continued, turning to those present, my voice trembling slightly, but I maintained my composure. This morning, while I was preparing for what should have been the happiest day of my life, Edward Thompson, the man who promised to honor and respect me, forced my cousin Helen to satisfy his desires. He hurt her, humiliated her, destroyed her dignity. Gasping exclamations of horror filled the church nave. Edward's face transformed into a mask of fury and fear. "This is absurd! She's hysterical! Don't believe her!" he shouted, grabbing my arm forcefully. I felt his fingers sinking into my skin, but I showed no pain. "Take your hands off me, Edward. It won't work twice in the same day." That's when the side doors of the church opened. Miss Eugenia entered, leading Helen by the arm. My cousin, still with swollen eyes from so much crying, the split lip, the purple mark on her face that even face powder couldn't hide. She wore a simple dress, different from the yellow one she was supposed to wear as a bridesmaid. My Aunt Eleanor and my Uncle Paul came right behind, their faces transformed by a mixture of shame and determination. A collective whisper ran through the church. Helen walked slowly, her gaze downcast, but her posture erect, led by Miss Eugenia, as if it were a solemn procession. When they reached the altar, they stopped beside me. "Look at her, Edward," I ordered. "Look at what you did." He didn't look. His green eyes, once so enchanting, now sparked with hatred, fixed on me. I noticed that his father, the powerful banker from Richmond, was already standing, visibly agitated, advancing down the center aisle. I imagined he would try to hush up the scandal, use his influence to transform the truth into female hysteria, to protect the family name. I was prepared for that too. "You're all crazy," Edward vociferated, alternating his gaze between me and Helen. "This is a setup. She's spiteful, jealous of her cousin who's going to marry a successful man. She made up this story because she always wanted me for herself." The cruelty of those words hit Helen like a physical blow. She staggered, supported by Miss Eugenia. That's when a strong, determined voice sounded from the back of the church. It was Mary, Edward's housekeeper, a middle-aged lady who had worked for him since he arrived in town. "It's not the first time," she said, walking slowly down the aisle, all heads turning to follow her. "It's not the first time Mr. Thompson has done this." Edward's face lost all color. He looked at the housekeeper as if he were seeing a ghost. "Shut your mouth, you meddling old woman!" he shouted, advancing toward her as if he were going to assault her right there at the altar. The pastor finally reacted, placing himself between them. Mary continued, impassive. 8 months ago, it was the Smith's daughter who worked as a maid at the house. 4 months ago, it was the baker's niece who came to deliver the cake for his birthday party. I turned a blind eye, kept quiet, was afraid of losing my job, but I can't carry this weight anymore. The church transformed into pandemonium. Mothers pulled their daughters close, looking horrified at Edward. Men stood up, some shouting insults, others demanding explanations. Edward's father, red with fury, tried to shout above the tumult that they were all lies, slanders against a respectable man. That's when the main door of the church violently opened. There, framed by the light of the late afternoon, stood Sheriff Miller, a corpulent man with a thick mustache, accompanied by 2 officers. "Edward Thompson," his voice thundered over the chaos. "You're detained for questioning about allegations of assault and violence against women." Time seemed to freeze. The silence returned, but now loaded with tension, like the air before a big storm. Edward looked around like a cornered animal. For a moment I thought he might try to escape, or even assault someone. But then his shoulders fell, and all that charm, all that confidence that once enchanted me disappeared, revealing the true nature of that man. "You have no proof of anything," he murmured, more to himself than to others, as the officers approached to take him away. "We have Helen's testimony," I replied, looking him directly in the eyes for the last time. "We have Mary's testimonies, and probably we'll have more when other victims learn they're not alone. We have the marks on my cousin's body, and we have this." I extended my hand to Miss Eugenia, who handed me a small package. From inside, I took out a handkerchief stained with blood, Edward's handkerchief with his embroidered initials that Helen had kept after the attack. "You left your marks on Helen, but you also left your signature at the crime scene," I concluded. As the officers led Edward out of the church, I felt as if an enormous weight had lifted from my shoulders. The price I would pay for that scene would be high. The scandal, the malicious comments, the shame of having my wedding transformed into a public spectacle. But looking at Helen, at the small light of relief that was beginning to shine in her eyes, I knew it would be worth it. The disaster of the morning had transformed into the biggest lesson of my life. I had learned in the most painful way possible that appearances deceive, that social masks can hide monsters, and that silence only protects the guilty. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The town talked of nothing else. The case made headlines in the local newspaper and even in the capital. "Bride uncovers crime and denounces groom at the altar," the headlines said. There were those who criticized me for exposing the case in that manner, for ruining the reputation of a respectable man over a misunderstanding. But for each voice of criticism, there were two of support, especially among women. What no one expected, however, was what happened next. 3 days after the non-wedding, when I was still hiding at home, avoiding curious looks and malicious comments, there was a knock at our door. It was Julie Smith, the carpenter's daughter who had briefly worked as a maid at Edward's house. She wanted to tell her story. The next day, it was Loretta, the baker's niece. After her came others. In total, 7 women of different ages and social classes, all with similar stories. Edward Thompson, the charming bank manager, the man who enchanted everyone with his smile and his education, had left a trail of victims silenced by fear and shame. A week later, I received a message from Sheriff Miller asking me to come to the station. I confess I hesitated. What more could he want? The case was already open, the complaints registered. It was Helen who convinced me to go. "You need to finish what you started, Charlotte," she said, her voice again gaining the firmness I had always admired. "Not just for me, but for all of them." When I arrived at the station, I was received not by the sheriff, but by Mrs. Miller, his wife, a middle-aged woman with kind and determined eyes. "My husband thought you would feel more comfortable talking to me first," she explained, leading me to a small room at the back of the station. There, to my surprise, were gathered all the women who had filed complaints against Edward, plus some I didn't know. "What's happening?" I asked, confused by that unexpected reception. Mrs. Miller smiled, a sad but determined smile. "These women want to thank you, not just for exposing Edward Thompson, but for giving them the courage to break the silence. Some had never told anyone what they suffered. Some carried this pain for years." An older lady I didn't know stood up and took my hands in hers. "My daughter suffered at the hands of a man like Edward when she was only 16. We never reported it, for fear of the scandal, the shame. She was never the same. Today she would be here, but she took her own life 5 years ago. What you did, my young woman, will save other girls from this fate." I felt hot tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of regret or sadness for the loss of what I believed was true love. They were tears of understanding, of a shared pain that somehow became more bearable when divided. It was at that moment, looking at those women of different ages, different stories, but united by a common experience of pain and silencing, that I made a decision that would change the course of my life, a decision that at that instant seemed as natural to me as breathing. "We need to do more," I said, wiping the tears with the back of my hand. "We can't let other women go through this in silence, thinking they're alone, that they won't be believed, that it's their fault." I looked at each of those women, seeing in them not just victims, but survivors, warriors who had found the courage to tell their stories. "What do you have in mind?" asked Mrs. Miller, her eyes shining with a hopeful curiosity. "A place where women can seek help, where they can tell their stories without fear of judgment, where they can find legal, medical, emotional support, a place that shows they are not alone." The idea, launched almost impulsively, was received with a reflective silence, followed by murmurs of approval. Mrs. Miller was the first to speak, her voice firm and decisive. "I support this idea with all my heart, and I'm sure my husband will also support it with whatever resources are at his disposal." "I can offer my house for the initial meetings," said Miss Eugenia, who had arrived silently and was observing the scene from the door. "I have some contacts in the capital who can guide us on the legal aspects." One by one, the women in the room began to offer what they could. Time, skills, contacts, small amounts of money. What began as a vague idea born of pain and indignation was rapidly taking shape, transforming into something concrete, tangible. There, in that small room at the Riverdale Springs police station in 1957, while America lived through the Eisenhower years and the world was caught up in the space race with the launch of Sputnik, a small group of courageous women planted the seeds of what would become the first women's support house in rural Virginia. We didn't know it yet, but that would be just the beginning of a much longer and more challenging journey than any of us could have imagined. A journey that would lead me down paths I never dreamed of traveling, facing resistance and prejudice, but also discovering unexpected strengths and allies. But at that moment, all I knew was that from the ashes of my failed wedding, from my cousin's trauma, from the collective pain of those women, something new was being born, something necessary, something that could really make a difference. And for the first time since I discovered Edward's true nature, I allowed myself to feel not just anger or sadness, but also hope, a fragile hope still, like a small sprout in freshly turned earth, but real and alive. The hope that perhaps through this personal tragedy, we could create something that would help other women avoid similar tragedies. It was the beginning of a new phase in my life. A phase I had never planned for, that I wasn't prepared for, but that I accepted with the same determination with which I had confronted Edward at the altar. The road would be long and difficult. Many battles were still to come, some of which I would lose, others that would demand more courage and resilience from me than I believed I possessed. But at that moment, surrounded by those brave women, I knew I wouldn't be alone. And that, more than anything else, gave me the strength to move forward. The months that followed Edward's arrest transformed our small town. What began as a local scandal quickly gained proportions that none of us could have imagined. A newspaper from Richmond sent a reporter to cover the case. Soon, other media outlets became interested in the story of the bride who denounced her own groom at the altar for assaulting her cousin. The trial was scheduled for October 1957, 5 months after that fateful day in May. During this period, the Women's Support House moved from idea to reality and began operating in a small 2-story building donated by Miss Eugenia, 2 blocks from the main square. We started modestly, with weekly meetings where women could share their experiences and seek comfort in each other. Gradually, with the help of volunteer professionals, a doctor, a nurse, a newly graduated lawyer, we expanded to offer more concrete assistance. Each small victory was celebrated, each obstacle faced with determination. When funds ran low, we organized charity bazaars. When malicious comments threatened to discourage us, we supported each other. It was a period of intense learning, not just about how to manage a support organization, but also about the depth and extent of the problem we were facing. The trial date was approaching, and with it grew my anxiety. Edward's father, using his influence, had hired one of the most renowned lawyers in Virginia to defend his son. Rumors were circulating that they would try to discredit Helen, paint her as a girl of questionable morals, perhaps even suggest that she had seduced Edward. It was a common tactic, I had learned, used to intimidate victims and dissuade them from taking their cases to court. But Helen was no longer alone, and neither was I. We had on our side not just our families, but also a growing group of supporters. Women who had found the courage to tell their own stories. Men who refused to condone the silence that protected abusers like Edward. And we had something even more powerful: the truth. On the eve of the trial, Helen came to me. We were on the porch of my parents' house, watching the sunset tinge the sky with orange hues. She seemed different. Not completely healed, for some wounds leave scars that never completely disappear, but stronger, with a determination that filled me with pride. "I'm afraid, Charlotte," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of what will happen tomorrow, of what they'll say about me, of the questions they'll ask." I held her hands in mine, feeling the slight tremor that ran through them. "I'm afraid too," I admitted. "It would be strange if we weren't. But you know what I fear even more? Staying silent, letting men like Edward continue doing what they do without consequences." Helen nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was now disappearing. "Our silence protects only the guilty," she said, repeating the words that had become a kind of mantra in our support house. "Tomorrow, I won't be silent." The next day, the Riverdale Springs courthouse was packed. The case had attracted so much interest that many people had to remain outside, crowded around the open windows to follow the proceedings. The October heat made the environment suffocating, despite the fans that lazily spun on the ceiling. Edward was brought to court in handcuffs, but wearing an impeccable suit. His face, once so full of charm and confidence, now showed visible signs of tension. He avoided looking in our direction, keeping his eyes fixed on his lawyer, a tall, thin man with graying hair, with an air of superiority that instantly irritated me. Judge Nogueira was known for his strictness and impartiality. His imposing presence imposed silence on the restless crowd. The trial began with the reading of the charges, each word echoing through the hall in a heavy silence. When it came time for Helen's testimony, I felt my heart tighten. She walked to the witness chair with firm steps, despite her pale face. She wore a simple navy blue dress with no adornment except for a small golden brooch, a gift from her mother to give her courage. For almost an hour, Helen recounted what happened that May morning, her voice occasionally faltering but never losing its firmness. She described how Edward had arrived unexpectedly, how she tried to flee when she realized his intentions, how he immobilized her, covering her mouth to muffle her screams. She described the pain, the fear, the humiliation, and she described how, afterward, he straightened his tie, smiled, and said that if she told anyone, no one would believe her. Edward's lawyer, as expected, tried to discredit her. He insinuated that she had seduced Edward, that she was resentful because he had chosen to marry me and not her. He went so far as to question why she had opened the door for him, why she was alone with him in the room, as if these were justifications for what happened afterward. To each insidious question, Helen responded with dignity, refusing to be intimidated. At a particularly tense moment, when the lawyer suggested she was making up the whole story to get attention, Helen looked directly at him and said in a clear voice, "Do you really think someone would voluntarily choose to go through this embarrassment, expose their private life in this way, face looks of pity and whispers behind their back just to get attention? No, sir. I'm here because it's the truth, and because I can't allow other girls to suffer what I suffered." A murmur of approval ran through the court, quickly silenced by the judge, but I could see in his eyes that Helen's words had touched him. Then it was my turn to testify. I told about Helen's behavior in the days leading up to the wedding, about how she seemed to avoid Edward, about the discovery on the morning of the wedding. That morning, when I saw the state my cousin was in, when I heard what Edward had done, something broke inside me, I explained, looking directly at the judge. Not just the love I believed I felt for him, but also a kind of innocence. The belief that good, respectable people would not be capable of such monstrous acts. I realized that silence and the appearance of respectability were the greatest allies of men like Edward. Mary, the housekeeper, also testified, reporting other incidents she had witnessed or become aware of. One after another, the victims who had come forward after the scandal took the witness stand, each testimony building a damning portrait of Edward Thompson. The defense lawyer did what he could to discredit each of them, but the consistency of the accounts, the courage with which they faced the embarrassment of exposing their stories, and the physical evidence in Helen's case, the blood-stained handkerchief, the bruises documented by a doctor, made his task almost impossible. Edward chose not to testify, a decision his lawyer certainly advised, but one that for many present seemed like an admission of guilt. After 2 days of testimonies and arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. We stayed in the courthouse corridor, a small group of women united by hope and fear. Helen, myself, Miss Eugenia, Mary, the other victims who had testified. Our hands intertwined, strengthening each other in silence. When the jury returned after 3 hours of deliberation, the silence in the courtroom was so absolute that one could hear a pin drop. The jury foreman, a respected farmer from the region, stood up to announce the verdict. "Guilty on all charges." The room exploded in reactions, shouts of approval, some indignant protests from Edward's family, Helen's cry of relief beside me. The judge hammered repeatedly, demanding order. When silence finally returned, he pronounced the sentence, 8 years in prison. Edward, who had remained impassive throughout the trial, finally lost his composure. He rose abruptly, shouting that he was innocent, that we were all crazy, that his father would buy half the town to free him, that he would make us pay for this. It took 2 guards to restrain him and drag him out of the courtroom, still shouting threats. I observed that scene with a strange feeling of peace. It wasn't vengeance I sought, I realized. It was justice. It was the guarantee that, at least for 8 years, Edward could not do to another woman what he had done to Helen, to so many others. It was the message to other victims. You are not alone. You can be heard. You can obtain justice. As we left the courthouse, we were greeted by a crowd. Women offered us flowers, shook our hands. Some cried as they thanked us. It was there, at that moment, that I fully understood the dimension of what we had initiated. It wasn't just about Edward, about Helen, about me. It was about all the women who had suffered in silence, who had been discredited, who had been blamed for crimes committed against them. On the sidewalk in front of the courthouse, a young reporter from the Richmond newspaper approached me, her notepad ready. "Miss Miller, how do you feel after the verdict?" I looked around at Helen, at the other women who had testified, at Miss Eugenia with her proud smile, at the dozens of unknown faces looking at us with hope and admiration. "I feel that this is just the beginning," I replied. "The end of a painful chapter, but the start of a much bigger story." And so it was. In the years that followed, our small support house grew, expanded, became a model for similar initiatives in other cities. Edward served 6 of his 8-year sentence, got a reduction for good behavior, and upon being released, discovered that his place in Riverdale Springs no longer existed. He moved to Oregon, where his crimes weren't known. We never heard from him again. The story of the bride who denounced her own groom at the altar became a kind of urban legend, told and retold, often with exaggerated or distorted details. Some said I had stabbed Edward at the altar, others that Helen was actually my sister. The truth, as so often happens, diluted with time, but the impact of that day remained. In 1964, when the social unrest of the civil rights movement was at its height, our support house faced new challenges. We were viewed with suspicion by some, labeled as subversives for daring to question established power structures. We had to learn to navigate this new political scenario, to protect our clients without attracting unwanted attention from authorities, to continue our work in an environment increasingly hostile to dissenting voices. It was a period of painful learning, of strategic retreats and careful advances. But we never abandoned our essential mission: to offer a safe space for women who had suffered violence, to give them a voice, to help them rebuild their lives. By 1970, our house had transformed into a women's support center with a more formal structure, broader resources, partnerships with health and legal professionals. We offered not just emotional support, but also legal guidance, medical assistance, professional training courses for women who needed to become financially independent after leaving abusive relationships. I never married. Many attributed this to the trauma of the experience with Edward, but the truth was more complex. I discovered there were other paths for a woman besides marriage and motherhood, paths that, in the 1950s, few dared to tread. I found purpose and fulfillment in my work, in the lives I helped rebuild, in the community we created around the center. Helen eventually married a doctor who came to work in Riverdale Springs in 1960. A gentle, patient man who understood her scars and respected her time of healing. They had 3 children, all now adults, all raised with a deep sense of respect for women, an understanding of consent and boundaries that was not common for their generation. And I dedicated my life to the center, to the cause that was born from that personal tragedy. I specialized in law, a scandalous decision for a woman in the 1960s, especially in a small town. I faced resistance, prejudice, closed doors, but also found unexpected allies, generous mentors, opportunities that arose when I least expected. The wedding dress I never wore was taken apart and made into christening gowns for Helen's children. The house that Edward built for our married life was eventually sold, and the money donated to the support center. The orchids that decorated the church that May Day were planted in the garden of the first permanent headquarters of the center, where they bloom to this day each spring, as a reminder that even from the most painful situations, something beautiful and meaningful can be born. The pain of that day never completely disappeared. There are moments when I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering Helen's face that morning, the shock of discovery, the feeling of having all my planned future crumbling around me. There are moments when I wonder how my life would have been if none of that had happened, if I had married Edward without knowing who he really was, or if I had discovered later, when I was already bound to him by matrimonial ties and perhaps by motherhood. But these reflections don't torment me as before. Time has that power, not to erase wounds, but to integrate them into our history, to transform them into part of what defines us without completely defining us. And if you ask me today, 6 decades later, if I regret the decision I made in that packed church in front of 200 guests and a groom who revealed himself to be a monster, my answer is simple. No, not for a moment. Because that painful and frightening decision, as it was, opened the way for a life I never imagined for myself. A life of purpose, of impact, of meaning. A life that I hope has made some difference. Today, sitting on the porch of my house overlooking the flowering garden I cultivate with such care, I observe the sunset tinging the sky of Riverdale Springs with the same orange hues I saw that afternoon more than half a century ago when everything changed. The orchids I transplanted from the first headquarters of the center to my private garden when I retired continue to bloom, stubborn and resilient, like the women I have helped throughout my life. At 83, I have the privilege that few receive, to look back and see that I made a difference. Not in the way I imagined when young, dreaming of a perfect marriage and children with Edward Thompson. Life had other plans for me. Plans that were born from a tragedy, but that blossomed into something much greater than I could ever have imagined. The 1970s were difficult times for our work. The Vietnam War and its aftermath dominated American consciousness, and any organization that defended human rights was viewed with suspicion. Our Women's Support Center survived through a tenuous balance between discretion and determination. We called crafting courses or cooking classes what were actually meetings where women could speak freely about the violence they suffered. The library where we kept materials about women's rights was hidden behind a false shelf in the basement of the house. I remember one dawn in 1972 when there was a knock at the center's door. It was a woman with a face so battered that her features were barely recognizable. In her arms, a baby of a few months, brought by a neighbor. She had fled after her husband, an army captain, threatened to kill her and the child during a fit of jealousy. "He'll find me," she repeated, trembling. "He has connections. He'll say I'm subversive, that I kidnapped our son." That night, while Helen tended to her wounds, Miss Eugenia, now elderly but still formidable, and I devised a bold plan. In 3 days, using a network of contacts carefully built over the years, we managed to get new documents for mother and child, bus tickets to the South, and a job as a primary school teacher in a small town in South Carolina where she had a distant cousin who agreed to take her in. Years later, we received a letter addressed simply to Angels of Riverdale. It was from her, with a graduation photo of her son, now a teenager about to enter medical school. "You saved 2 lives that night," she wrote. "I will never forget." It wasn't the first time we needed to act in the shadows, and it wouldn't be the last. Each case required a different approach. Each woman had her unique story of pain and resilience. We learned to improvise, to use the limited resources we had, to find allies in the most unlikely places. One of these unexpected allies emerged in 1975, during the International Women's Year declared by the UN. Sheriff Miller, now close to retirement, sought me out privately. His wife, Mrs. Miller, had passed away the year before after dedicating more than a decade to volunteer work at our center. "My Clara made me see the world differently," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Before her, I was like so many other men of my generation, blind to women's suffering, deaf to their calls for help." He handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a considerable sum of money and documents detailing cases of domestic violence that had been filed away or ignored by the local police over the past 20 years. "Use it as you see fit," he said simply, "to honor her memory." The money allowed us to buy a larger house that would become the new headquarters of the center. The documents became the basis of an archive that years later would be fundamental in proving the systematic pattern of negligence by authorities in cases of violence against women, evidence that would help shape new public policies. The 1980s brought new challenges and opportunities. With the rise of feminism's second wave, we could finally come out of the shadows. Our center joined the national women's movement that fought for legislative changes, for specialized police stations, for more visibility for issues that for so long had been relegated to the private sphere, to the silence of homes. In 1985, we inaugurated the first women's police station in our region, an achievement that seemed impossible when we began our work almost 3 decades earlier. I was invited to the inauguration ceremony, where I received a plaque in recognition of the years of service to the community. As I spoke, I looked at the audience and saw faces of women we had helped over the years. Some now with gray hair like mine, others still young, many accompanied by daughters and granddaughters. It was a moment of profound emotion to realize that our work had crossed generations. Helen was there, of course, seated in the first row. At 48, she had become a force of nature in her own right. After raising her 3 children, she went back to school, graduated in psychology, and went on to coordinate the psychological service of the center. Her husband, Dr. Paul, became an important ally, offering free medical care to the women we sheltered. From the 1990s, with age advancing, I began gradually to pass the leadership of the center to younger hands, women who had grown up in an America different from that of my youth, but who still faced many of the same challenges. I officially retired in 1997 at 62, although I continued as a counselor and mentor. It was around this time that I received the visit that would once again change the course of my life. A young researcher from the State University was collecting stories of women who had made a difference in their communities during the civil rights era. Someone had told her about the girl who denounced her groom at the altar and the work that was born from that event. "Your story needs to be told, Ms. Charlotte," she insisted after hours of recording my accounts on a series of cassette tapes, not just for historical preservation, but as inspiration. "The new generations need to know that women like you opened paths in much more difficult times." I hesitated initially. I had never been one to seek the spotlight, to position myself as the protagonist of a struggle that I always considered collective. But Helen, always sensible, convinced me. "It's not about you, Charlotte," she argued. "It's about what can happen when we decide not to stay silent. It's about showing that even in the most desperate situations, there is always a choice, always hope." Thus was born the book, The Bride Who Said No, published in 2000. To my surprise, the work gained national repercussion, was adopted in university courses, inspired discussion groups. Suddenly, at 65, I found myself invited to lectures, interviews, debates. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, all this attention after decades of discreet work. With time, I understood the value of sharing our story. Each time I spoke in public, always making a point of emphasizing that it wasn't just my story, but that of all the women who built the center with me. I afterward received messages from young women inspired to make a difference in their own communities. Some even created initiatives similar to our center in other cities, adapted to local needs and realities. What began as the personal tragedy of a betrayed bride and an assaulted cousin had transformed into a movement that crossed geographical and generational boundaries. It was more than I could ever have imagined on that fateful May morning of 1957. In 2007, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Riverdale Springs Women's Support Center with a grand ceremony. The small initiative that began in a room at the police station now occupied an entire complex, with temporary shelter for women at risk, medical and psychological offices, legal assistance, professional training courses, daycare for the children of those we assisted, a specialized library. More than 50 professionals, mostly women, some of whom had been assisted by the center in moments of vulnerability, worked there daily. During the celebration, a young woman approached me timidly. She appeared to be about 20, with short hair, expressive eyes that reminded me of someone. "You don't know me," she began hesitantly, "but my grandmother told me a lot about you. She said that if it weren't for your courage, I might not even exist." I looked at her confused, trying to identify familiar traits. "My grandmother is Loretta, the baker's niece," she explained, seeing my confusion. "One of the women who testified against Edward Thompson at the trial." The memory came immediately. Loretta, so young and frightened, telling how Edward had cornered her in the pantry when she went to deliver a cake to his house. how she had escaped, unlike other victims, and told her aunt, who forbade her from returning to that house but didn't report the case for fear of losing clientele. Grandma always said that the day she saw you confronting Edward at the altar was the day she realized she didn't need to be ashamed, that it wasn't her fault. The young woman smiled, her eyes tearing up. That's when she began to rebuild her life. She married years later, had my mother, who had me. Recently, I graduated in law, inspired by your story. I want to work with women's rights, continue what you started. At that moment, I understood the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't the buildings, the programs, the impressive statistics of women assisted over decades. It was this: transformed lives that transform other lives in an unbroken chain of healing and empowerment. Now in 2025 at 83, I observe the changes and the continuities. I see with joy the advances, more effective laws, greater awareness, spaces for speech that didn't exist in my youth. I see with concern the setbacks, the resistance, the new forms that violence assumes in a digitized world. I see young activists fighting with the same passion that moved us, facing some of the same obstacles we faced, albeit in different contexts. And I see, above all, that the fight I initiated on that distant May Day of 1957 wasn't just for my time, or even for Helen's time. It was a fight for all the women who would come after us, for those not yet born. The center we founded continues strong, adapting to new realities, facing new challenges. Helen took over the direction when I retired, and years later passed the baton to her eldest daughter, Clara, named in honor of Sheriff Miller's wife. Now a third generation is beginning to get involved, bringing new ideas, new approaches, but keeping alive the essence of what we built. Edward Thompson died in 1999 at 72, alone in a nursing home in Oregon. When I heard the news, I felt neither joy nor sadness, just the certainty that justice, in some form, had been done. Not the punitive justice of the courts, which he served only partially, but the restorative justice of a community that refused to remain silent, that created resources to protect other women, that transformed pain into purpose. Sometimes, when young journalists or students approach me for interviews, they ask if I regret not having had children, not having formed a traditional family. I smile at these questions, which reveal so much about how society still views the role of women. My family is larger than any traditional family could be, I always respond. They are the hundreds of women who passed through the center, the thousands of lives that were saved or transformed by the work we initiated. They are the young women who, inspired by our story, created their own support centers in other cities. They are the laws we helped change, the consciousnesses we helped awaken. And it's true. I never lacked love, purpose, or a sense of fulfillment in my life. The path wasn't what I planned in my youth, but it was infinitely more meaningful than I could have imagined. Now, as the sun finishes setting on the horizon of Riverdale Springs, I feel a profound gratitude for the path that life led me to travel. It wasn't easy. There were moments of excruciating pain, of paralyzing doubt, of discouragement in the face of obstacles that seemed insurmountable. There were tears, sleepless nights, strategic retreats, lost battles, but there were also moments of indescribable joy, of shared triumph, of solidarity that transcends words. There were grateful embraces, reborn smiles, futures rebuilt from the ashes of painful pasts. There was a community of women and some allied men who refused to accept that things had always been this way, who had the courage to imagine and build a different world. That is the legacy I hope to leave when my time here ends. Not monuments or tributes, but transformed lives that continue transforming other lives. A wave that began with an act of courage on a May Day in 1957 and continues spreading far beyond what I can see or imagine. And to you who have accompanied me to this point in the story, I want to say thank you. Thank you for listening to me, for not looking away from difficult truths, for allowing my story to resonate with your own experiences, hopes, and dreams. If this story touched your heart, please give me a like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Also, join the WhatsApp group of Grandparents' Tales that's in the video description. There, we share daily stories of overcoming and mutual support. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my life stories. Together, we can continue building a world where no woman needs to face violence in silence. Because, in the end, that's what our struggle is about. Not revenge, not punishment, but healing. Not just for ourselves, but for all who came before and all who will come after. A healing that's only possible when we break the silence, when we share our stories, when we refuse to accept that things are just the way they are. I am Charlotte Miller, the bride who said no. And this is my story, a story that I hope continues inspiring courage long after my voice falls silent.